those who did economics at +2 level, they know some parts of these demand and supply curves. However, we are starting from the beginning assuming that no one has any idea about what is meant by demand curve, what is meant by supply curve. So those who didn't do any economics earlier, for them it is a fresh thing. For others, you did this thing using different concepts, different ideas. Okay, so please check what will be the approach, what will be the definitions which we will follow at the major level. Okay, so there may be some differences in the definitions or ideas or analysis. Okay, so please take care of that thing. And the reference, as I mentioned, any book based on principles, that will be the reference. Okay, so let's first start with the basics of demand and supply. We are starting with market because market is the institution where both the demanders and the suppliers are coming and they are interacting with each other. Okay, so we are starting with market. Market has in the market there will be two agents, buyers, whom we are calling demanders, or from the buyers we will get the demand for the commodity or the service, and there will be another group whom we are calling sellers, and sellers will supply something. So we need to learn about the demand curve, demand function, supply curve, supply function. What are the major determinants of demand? What are the major determinants of supply? So all these things we need to do. And finally, how to combine these two concepts, introducing the notion of equilibrium. That will be the matters on which we will concentrate. So let's first start with the demand and supply curves. So let's first consider the features of the demand curves. Demand curves are negatively sloped. Demand curves are negatively sloped. Okay. So it can be a straight line, it can be a curvilinear line, which will be negatively sloped. For simplicity, generally you will find that in almost entire analysis, we are considering a linear curve. However, it can be non-linear as well. So what does it mean, negative slope? What does it mean? An increase in price is likely to lead to decrease in quantity demanded, and a decrease in price is likely to lead to an increase in quantity demanded. That is, there is an inverse relationship between price and quantity. Okay? An increase in price may result in a decrease in demand, and a decrease in price will result in an increase in demand. Okay, before going to the philosophy why this happens, the first I'm telling about the features. So let me mention the features of the demand curve. The demand curve intersects the quantity axis. Okay, so I can extend this demand curve, and this demand curve may intersect the quantity axis. Okay, and then I can extend the curve like this. That is, it is intersecting the x-axis or the horizontal axis in this point. Okay. Now, why the curve may intersect at the horizontal axis? If I measure price along the vertical axis, quantity along the horizontal axis, curve is intersecting the x-axis means the price of the commodity is equal to 0. Price of the commodity is equal to 0. Okay. Now, price of the commodity is equal to 0. That means you are not willing to pay anything for this amount. When you are getting this much, you are not willing to pay anything for this commodity. Okay. Now, why this happens psychologically? Coming at a certain point, you will be not willing to pay for a certain commodity. because of presence of diminishing marginal utility, because of presence of diminishing marginal utility. Okay. Now, what is marginal utility? In context of economics, margin means change. Margin means change. Okay. Utility indicates satisfaction. We will talk about much of this concept when we will go to the consumer theory. So far, we are considering utility as the state of satisfaction we are getting out of consuming certain commodity or service. Marginal utility means change in utility due to change in consumption by 1 unit. Marginal utility indicates change in utility due to change in consumption by 1 additional unit. Then I added a term, diminishing marginal utility. So there is a principle which we call the diminishing marginal utility. As we consume more and more of a particular commodity, other things remaining unchanged. As we consume more and more of a commodity, other things remaining constant, additional satisfaction we get out of that commodity, that goes down. Additional satisfaction that we get out of that commodity, that goes down. So, diminishing marginal utility, okay? Because of presence of this diminishing marginal utility, because of limitations in time, etc., what happens when we get a commodity too much? In that case, the commodity becomes a free good. Okay, nobody is willing to pay anything for that commodity. So, logically, the demand curve may intersect the horizontal axis. Alternatively, the demand curve may intersect the vertical axis as well. The demand curve may intersect the vertical axis as well. That is, we can extend this curve logically at this point. Okay, so it can intersect y-axis as well. So if it, intersects y-axis, or why it intersects y-axis, because price is indication of your willingness to pay. Price is measure of willingness to pay. So you will be not willing to pay unlimited amount for a commodity because you are constrained by your income. So the maximum price you will be able to give, or maximum price you will be willing to give to have 1 unit of commodity that is fixed or that is constrained, that is facing a limitation by your income. Okay, so the demand you are presenting, that can intersect the y-axis as well based on your purchasing power, based on your income, etc., based on your wealth, etc. Okay, so logically, the curve can intersect both the horizontal as well as the vertical axis. Demand depends on a number of factors. Among these factors, the most important factor is, or the most important determinant of demand is price. So that, if you present the most simplified version of the demand function, it will be presented as QD as a function of P, QD as a function of P with D prime P less than 0. Okay, because the demand curve is negatively sloped. So this is the simplest functional form by which we can present a demand function. QD is a function of P, D of P, function of P. More specifically, if we consider a linear demand curve, we can present the demand curve as QD is equal to A minus BP. We are considering a linear functional format. In general, it is a function of P. However, if we consider a specific linear format, we can present it as A minus BP. Then the slope of the demand curve indicates dQ by dP, and it is presented by minus B. So the slope of the demand curve is negative. This dQ by dP indicates the slope of the demand curve. Okay. Now I'll mention one important thing. I am telling that demand is a function of P. Demand is a function of P. I'm mentioning this. Okay. So which one is the dependent variable and which one is the independent variable?
Ma'am, D is the dependent and P is the independent.
P is independent variable and D is the dependent variable. Everyone, is it okay to all of you?
Yeah,
P
ma'am.
is variable. Okay. So anyone, if P is the independent variable, which axis will be the best axis to present P? If we follow the mathematical
X-axis.
X-axis generally
X-axis.
takes the independent axis.
Okay, so if P is the independent variable, it should be measured along the horizontal axis and Q should be measured along the vertical axis, isn't it? So if we follow the mathematical principle, this will be the thing. QD will be measured along the vertical axis, whereas P will be measured along the horizontal axis. However, I didn't do that. I am considering Q along the horizontal axis and P along the vertical axis. Okay. So I am measuring Q along the horizontal axis, P along the vertical axis. So this is nothing but inverse demand curve. I am considering the reverse axis to present the demand curve. So this is called the inverse demand curve. If we measure Q along the horizontal axis and P along the vertical axis, and we draw the demand curve in this way, though it is simply, I am calling it a demand curve, it is nothing but an inverse demand curve. If we match the graph with the mathematical function, it is nothing but the inverse demand curve. Am I right? Everybody is getting this point?
Ma'am,
Yes,
can you
ma'am.
tell once more
Yes,
this about the inverse demand curve?
Yes. I am telling that Q is a function of P. Okay? QD is a function of P.
Yeah.
However, while I am putting the demand curve using a graph, I am measuring Q along the horizontal axis, P along the vertical axis.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay? So the graph I am presenting, you know, in that case, I am considering isn't it? If I consider
Yes, ma'am.
the horizontal axis and P along the vertical axis, am I not using this functional form?
Exactly, ma'am.
Okay, so what I am plotting is nothing but inverse demand curve, inverse functional form.
Yes, ma'am. Now I can understand. Okay, ma'am. I got it.
Everybody is understanding this? So the demand curve we are plotting is nothing but inverse demand function. Are you understanding, everybody?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
This is called the Marshallian convention. Alfred Marshall, developed the concept of demand. First, you know, tried to frame a demand function like this. He, for the first time, tried to develop a function where he told that demand is a function of price. However, when he presented it graphically, he considered Q along the horizontal axis and P along the vertical axis, because at that moment, mathematics, background mathematics was not that strong to tell us, this variable should be considered as independent variable, this variable should be considered as the dependent variable, independent variable should be measured along this axis, dependent variable should be measured along this axis, okay? So this mathematical concept was not that developed, okay? Or Alfred Marshall could not relate the function in a perfect way to the current understanding of the mathematics regarding plotting the independent and the dependent variable. So what he did, he considered price along the vertical axis and Q along the horizontal axis, So still now, we follow that pattern of presenting the demand curve. When we write the function, we rightly frame the function as QD is a function of P. However, when we draw the curve, we measure P along the vertical axis and Q along the horizontal axis following the Marshallian convention. And for that matter, we say that the curve we are drawing, that is following the inverse demand function. Okay, so the demand curve we generally present, that is nothing but inverse demand function. It is not presenting the demand function, rather it is presenting the inverse demand function. Okay, now the logic, why we are considering this feature. When price increases, quantity demanded will fall. When price decreases, quantity demand will go up. Why this feature? Price rise impoverishes the consumers, that is, it adversely affects the purchasing power of consumers and thereby reduce the demand. Consumers' income is fixed. Now, if in a given bundle, price of certain commodity increases, to maintain the demand or to maintain the consumption of the rest of the commodities, naturally individual need to reduce the consumption of the commodity for which the price is increasing. I started to talk about the breakfast basket consisting of bread and butter, egg, milk, etc. So if this is the breakfast basket, if the price of butter increases too much, in that case, we have to change the consumption of butter in a particular way so that I can maintain the satisfaction which I get out of the entire breakfast basket. Okay, so price rise impoverishes the consumer, and this adversely affects the purchasing power, and thereby consumer reduces the demand for the commodity. Okay, so price of the bread goes up. It means that the purchase as much of every good as you were purchasing before, you require more money. Since you have a given income or limited means, this may force you to reduce the purchase of most goods, including bread. Okay, so all these things are happening. So here I have introduced one concept, I think, real income, the idea of real income. So in economics, always parallel to the actual, always we mention about what is the real thing. For the price, I mentioned the nominal price, real price. For the income too, I need to think about absolute and real. Real income is the Okay, so this is the real income. Real income is the absolute income divided by price. When price of one particular commodity is increasing, what is happening? The real income is falling. Other things remaining constant. Real income, purchasing power, that is falling. Real income of the individual or the purchasing power of the individual, that is falling. And as real income of the individual falls, individual needs to reduce consumption of all commodities, including the item for which there is a hike in price, there is an increase in price. Okay, so when there is an increase in price, it affects the real income of the individual, it affects the purchasing power of an individual, and for that matter, individual needs to reduce consumption of, say, all commodities in the basket to some extent, or at least the commodity for which there is an increase in price. So all these things happen. So this is the thing. Another important thing is price is the endogenous determinant of demand. Now, I mentioned there are many determinants of demand. Among these, price is the most important. Now, more specifically, I am clearing the matter. There are two types of variables in the system, endogenous and exogenous. Endogenous means the variable which crops up from the system, which affects the system and is affected by the system. Which affects the system and is affected by the system. Okay. So price is a variable which affects the demand and is affected by the demand. So price is considered as the endogenous variable, endogenous determinant. Okay. There are several other determinants of demand as well. However, all these determinants are considered as exogenous determinants. Exogenous determinants. For the exogenous determinants, you can set up a ceteris paribus condition. That is, these things you can keep constant. Among these things, you can change one, keeping rest of the things constant. That is, you can manipulate. However, for the endogenous thing, you will be not able to manipulate, because if quantity demand changes, price will automatically change. So the price moves along the demand curve. It is an endogenous variable. If demand changes, price changes. If price changes, demand changes. So there is one-to-one correspondence between price and quantity demanded. Okay. So if demand changes, price will change. If price changes, demand will change. Okay. So it moves along the demand curve. However, for the exogenous determinants, which will be price of the other commodities, income of the individual, taste and preference of the individual, geographical location, gender of the individual, education of the individual, education of the parents, schooling, many things are there to determine the demand. Okay. So all these things are exogenous. So you can keep all these things constant. You can change one at a time. These things will happen, and this will make a shift of the demand curve. So we will come to these points. So next we are coming to the exogenous determinants. Okay. First, I'm starting with price of the other goods and services. Prices of the related goods and services. Here, the two concepts are important. One is the concept of substitutes, and another is the concept of complementary commodities. Now, what is meant by substitutes? When an increase in price of one good causes the increase in demand for the other, then the commodities are substitutes to each other. What does it mean? I'm considering two commodities, say X and Y. Price of X, income of the individual, taste and preference, And rest of the things I mentioned, everything remain constant, same. Only price of Y is increasing. Other things remaining constant, price of Y is increasing. Now, because of increase in price of Y, it may happen that demand for Y is falling, and that in turn is increasing the demand for X. Demand for Y is falling. However, that in turn is increasing the demand for X when price of X has remained unchanged. If there is this kind of relationship, then we will call X and Y are substitutable. You can substitute Y by X. Price of Y is increasing, consumption of Y is falling, and you are substituting this by increasing the consumption of X. So if X1 is a substitute of another commodity whose price has gone up, it may induce the consumer to substitute the former for the latter. For example, if X1 is rice, an increase in the price of wheat may induce the consumers to substitute wheat for rice to escape the adverse impact of the price rise. Tea and coffee is the most popular example. If the price of tea goes up, in that case, price of coffee remaining unchanged, demand for coffee increases. So all these things happen in reality. If this kind of relationship exists, we will call the commodities substitutes to each other. Rice and wheat, tea and coffee, these are the examples of substitutes. Complementary goods. When an increase in price of one good causes the reduction in demand for the other, then the commodities are called complementary to each other. Example is bread and butter. If the price of bread increases, that in turn reduces the consumption of butter, because generally bread and butter are consumed together. So if the price of bread increases and that in turn reduces the demand for bread, that will affect the demand for butter, reducing it, though the butter price remains unchanged. So there are examples like tea and milk, tea and sugar, etc. The commodity pen and ink, hardware and software, like this. So thus, prices of other goods may affect the demand for commodity for many reasons, and hence we have them as arguments in the demand function. We are considering them as exogenous determinants of the demand function. So we are bringing them in demand function. However, please don't think that there will be always substitutes for a commodity or there will be always complements for a commodity. Okay. So no way the demand for tea and demand for shoe is related. Demand for shoe may be related to demand for dresses. However, it is not related to demand for tea. Okay. So if you want to consider totally unrelated commodities and trying to establish there is some correlations among these purchases, these are nothing but spurious correlations. These are not the real correlations, these are spurious correlations, okay? So it is not that there should be substitutes for all commodities or there should be complements for all commodities. It may happen that commodities are totally unrelated to each other. Commodities in your basket is totally unrelated to each other. The next important external determinant is income and wealth. An increase in income improves the economic condition and thereby purchasing power of consumers. We defined the purchasing power by income deflated by price. Okay. So other things remaining constant, that is prices of all commodities remaining constant, if there is an increase in income, that improves economic condition as well as the purchasing power of the consumers. This is likely to increase the demand for goods. So as income and wealth increases, it is likely that there will be an increase in demand for goods. However, there are different types of goods in reality. There are certain ranges of commodities for which really this will happen. If real income increases, demand for these goods are increasing. These commodities will be called the normal goods. However, in reality, there are commodities for which the demand will fall as income increases. Now, if you consider the basic needs, basic healthcare facility, basic education facility, the basic minimum food items that we need to survive. If you consider the basic items, you will find that as income as well as the purchasing power of the individuals improve, they spend more on luxury items, conspicuous consumption, rather than spending on the basic items. So the basic items in that case will be considered as the inferior goods. If we find that as income increases, spending on certain commodities is falling, we will consider the commodities the inferior goods. In general, what happens if income improves, people will shift from potato to food items like, chicken or fish, etc. More chicken, more fish, etc. So in that case, potato will be considered as inferior good. As your income is increasing, purchasing power is improving, you are consuming lesser potato and, more of the items which are more expensive in the food basket. Okay. So, however, the definition of inferior commodities will move from one group to other. To me, potato may be the luxurious item. However, to you, potato may be the inferior commodity. So it will totally depend on in which income bracket I am there. Okay. So it will depend on my purchasing power. Okay. So for a group, a particular set of commodities may be luxurious, but for the another group, that basket of commodities may be inferior. So it may vary from group to group, from individual to individual. Okay. So we cannot label a particular commodity as inferior good as such. It will depend on, for the particular individual I'm considering the commodity. Any question?
Ma'am, what happens in case of different goods?
When the time will come, I'll talk about that. Okay. Because
What,
for
ma'am?
before defining
ma'am.
different groups, etc., we need to learn a lot of things. So, just simply, I'm putting the definitions of the normal and the inferior here. Okay, and somebody else had some question?
Ma'am, I told ma'am what she told ma'am actually, and what you were telling, I just can't listen, ma'am.
I didn't get you.
Ma'am, you told na that we will be studying that definition later. What was the term, ma'am?
Giffen good. Giffen.
Oh, that's
Okay.
I don't.
Following the name of Giffen, Giffen, Giffen goods. Inferior goods can be of different types, So to define given good, we need to learn a lot of things. Income effect, substitution effect, when a commodity, inferior commodity becomes a given good. So a lot of things are there.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so who asked the question know all about the things, because, I mentioned, some people are here who has some background of economics. Some people are here who are coming from directly from science background. So at this moment, it will be difficult to talk about the given goods. When time will come, I'll talk about all these things, However, try to remember all the commodities in the reality are not normal goods, or this relation is not that simple. If income increases, demand for the commodity will increase. It will depend on the nature of the commodity, nature of the individual. Some commodities will appear as normal goods. For some commodities, we will find that, as income increases, we are reducing consumption of these commodities. In general, for the literature of, development economics, we find that carbohydrate foods are considered as inferior food items, whereas protein foods are considered as more luxurious or normal kind of items. However, most of you like to consume more of potato chips, etc. So it will be really, really difficult to understand whether potato is really inferior or not. Okay, so all these issues are there, different issues are there, and we are not rational as such. Whatever we like to do that. So all these things are there. However, the proper definitions of normal goods and inferior goods are there, and please look at this moment, please look at these definitions. The other external determinants or important external determinants are taste and preferences and or cultural attitudes. Actually, taste and preferences are developed using the culture, so taste and preferences and or cultural attitudes are there. Other things remaining constant, if tastes and preferences goes in favor of a commodity, demand increases and vice versa. Okay, so always there is some change in the cultural attitude depending on social mixing, education, etc. And you will find that other things remaining constant if you somehow if there is certain changes in your taste and preferences, naturally the demand for the commodities also changes. Expectation about the future prices, other things remaining constant. If a consumer expects that price will increase in future, the demand increases. However, this is possible only for the non-perishable commodities. It is not possible for the perishable commodities. For perishable commodities, you cannot make a stock and you cannot increase the demand as such if you understand that future price of the commodity will increase. Okay. Change in composition of the population. Now, in certain population, the proportion of young aged people is higher. In certain population, the proportion of children is higher. In certain population, proportion of aged is higher. So depending on the the demographic factors, there may be certain changes in the demand pattern of the entire community. Okay, so can you tell me for which country the population is most aged?
Japan, Italy.
Japan. Very good. Japan is the number one. For the entire European belt, all these things are there. There is the problem of aging. However, the Japan is number one. Change in information. Okay, this is very important, changes in information. So if you have more information, nowadays, whenever we are getting the term, we are doing a Google and we are trying to get some information, So under many circumstances, this will change my demand pattern. Okay, if I Google for certain things and if we understand good and bad for consuming this commodities, so naturally there will be certain changes in my demand pattern. So information is important. Another thing is advertisement expenditure. Information comes through advertisement. So depending on the nature of advertisement, the level of information will vary, and accordingly the demand pattern may change. Availability of credit. Okay, so we may have certain taste and preference, we may have certain choices. However, depending on availability of the loanable funds, credit, we will be able to do these or that. So demand may depend on availability of the credit as well. Just okay, I think this is all for today. I'll stop here and we will start to discuss the other few issues in the next class.
Okay, ma'am.
Ma'am,
Okay?